Stuart Holbrook has spent his life in the world of collectors. As president of Theriault, the world's leader in the auction of antique dolls and figurative art for over 30 years, he's managed the often personal and always wild world of collecting and collectors. His market expertise and knowledge of trends comes to life in The Curious Collector, where he shares his experience and experiences in real-life stories, alongside sage advice on how to build great collections within the happy life of a collector.
Hello, everyone. Stuart Holbrook back with you for episode 28 of The Curious Collector as we roll down memories, thoughts, concepts, opinions of different things within the world of collecting. I'm very happy to come here again with you today to talk about something that is very close to my heart, obviously, auctions and my most memorable auctions over the years. So we'll talk about that in a few minutes, but first of all, just give you an update. I'm actually home. Just rolled in last night from Denver, Colorado, where I spoke to the legendary doll club, the Denver Dollars, who were fantastic, and then popped right on over to Omaha, Nebraska, and spoke to, I love the name of this club, Can't Stop Collecting Club of Omaha. And I agree, you should never be able to stop collecting, and they clearly can't. They named their club after it. So we had a blast there. This was a special club for me because it was a year ago exactly that I was in Omaha, and one of the members of the club, Margaret Hine, actually, who's a longtime friend, great collector, she knew I was there in the city, and she was having a doll club meeting and begged me just to come over and talk to the club for a few minutes and say hi. I thought, sure, why not? So I popped in. I ended up being there for a couple of hours because you know me, once I get started talking, I cannot stop. And I realized what an amazing experience it was. We just sat around the table and talked. And that grew into the whole lecture circuit that I've been on this year of 65 cities around America and towns, meeting with doll clubs called Table Talk. And so it was my return to them and a thanks to them for spawning this idea of the Table Talk tour, although I admitted to them that there were a few times after 18-hour days of getting from one city to the next to do a talk that I was cursing their name for the idea. But all in all, it was a really wonderful experience to be back with them. And I'm looking forward to getting through some auction events. And then it's back on the Table Talk tour again. Back on to, where am I going? Wichita, Kansas, which is my sort of final one out in the Midwest and West Coast and Southeast area, because I focus then completely in the fall on the Northeast, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New England. I'm coming to you and really excited about it. So let's get right into this. Oh, I do want to bring up a couple of things regarding my last podcast, which had a huge amount of comments and people talking about it, and that is tariffs and collecting. I hope that I brought some clarity to you all as to the background and different perspectives from Europe and America as far as duties, tariffs, taxes, and all these little adjuncts and things that we see out there nowadays, especially currently with the blanket tariffs that have come about here in the U.S. But I had a few comments that I thought were really interesting. One was when I talked about dealers in Europe selling pieces, one thing that was clarified was that dealers don't have to identify specifically the VAT amount. It is rolled into the actual selling price. So I talked about that. So a little bit of a correction right there. So if they sell something for 3,000 euros, that VAT is actually included in that 3,000 euros. And then they privately report that to the government as to what their actual margin is. Remember, we talked about margins. If you haven't listened to that podcast, please go back. I think you'll find it interesting, even if you could care less about tariffs. But I think you might find it interesting anyway, because it gives different perspectives as well, how Europeans kind of have an advantage these days in buying because they don't have anywhere near the level of extra charges that we have now with the blanket tariffs on antiques. So anyway, just wanted to correct that. And it was another interesting point made. I had a comment that you can read on The Curious Collector of a person who imported some artworks from Europe and actually did get charged the tariffs, because remember we talked about that art is technically tariff-free, that is fine art. And so I'm not sure, because that is actually not correct overall. I don't know the specifics of his import or the specifics of the items themselves, but do keep in mind if you are importing artworks, they should technically be duty free here or tariff free here in the U.S. coming in, even with the blanket tariffs. And so I found it fascinating, and it probably had something to do with the way they were invoiced, how the items were invoiced or described, or the person just didn't push hard enough. I don't know. But anyway, I thought that was an interesting comment as well. So don't just assume if it's a one-off, one-of-a-kind or important art piece that it may be free of the tariffs. You may have to fight a little bit for it. So that's all my recaps and going back to some previous podcasts and talking about where I've been. Let's get right into it today. And we're going to talk about my most memorable auctions. Now, I've been doing this for a lot of years. I've grown up in the business, obviously, went off to college and really came full back into the business, as I've talked about before, in 1987. So you can kind of do the math. That's 38 years I've been up on the podium doing auctions all over the country. Some unbelievable thousands and thousands of events, millions of dollars over these years. And I've seen a lot. And I have certain auctions that do, though, for one reason or another, always stick in my mind or a memory, whether it's lighthearted or emotional or for whatever reason. And I want to talk about some of those sales today. I mean, I've got about 20 of them. Tammy, my producer, is probably cringing right now thinking, no, please don't make this a 2-hour podcast. But I'll try to be brief on a lot of them and go through and explain why these certain sales are some of my most memorable. And a lot of these you can actually go back to Theriault.com, go to our archive catalogs, and you might want to go peer at some of these and take a look at the offerings and what was in there in relationship to things I'm talking about today. Now, keep in mind, the most memorable auctions aren't necessarily the biggest events ever held or the highest grossing sales ever done by Theriault or the ones that brought us the most notoriety. Some of them might be, but a lot of them may be just innocent little auctions, or in one case, an actual failure of an auction that really stuck in my mind over the years. And I want to share these with you so you know, and there's no necessary order to this. It's just going to be random as I go through and tell you about each of them. So let's start off with the beginning, because this one will be the first one because it was my first one. And, you know, you always remember your first kiss, your first car, your first boyfriend or girlfriend, your first whatever. These things always tend to stick in your mind over the years. You know, my first car I can remember was an MG, and what a horrible mistake that was. Can I tell you what my third car was? I have no clue. But the first one you always remember. So I'll always remember that first big collection I ever got. And that was the Doris Hupp collection of Stillwater, New Jersey. And that auction sticks in my mind because it was an auction that I got the collection. It was a complete fluke. And it was the first major sale that I was up on the podium with after coming back from college, from university. So Doris Hupp, I've talked about her quite a bit over the years, and I'm pretty sure I've mentioned her on previous podcasts. But in case you haven't heard about it, it was an incredible collection in itself because Doris passed away at like 97, and her brother, who was, I think, 99 at the time, called me and said he's got this house full of dolls. He said, I don't know if there's anything in here, but could you please come and take a look for me and just make sure before we throw them all away? She never really had any money. She was a spinster school teacher. And I don't know if you can use the word spinster nowadays, but I'm going with it. If you complain, I'll give you my email address and you can yell at me. But she never really had much money. So I went up and decided, you know, before cell phones and email, you just had to go look at the stuff. You had no clue, especially when the person said they didn't know what's there. So I drove 4.5 hours up to Stillwater, walked in. It ended up being an entire house filled of incredible French bébés and fashions and automatons and brews and Hurets galore, early English wooden, early paper mache, everything imaginable that you would dream of from a fabulous, great collection. And I was completely happy and completely shocked as well. It was like walking into King Tut's tomb because it was totally unexpected, which made it even more special. And I would say that's the moment I really got hooked into the business for sure, of that feeling of walking in and discovering something that was hidden and buried for decades and decades. Because as it turns out, as I was talking to Fred, I found out how Doris was able to achieve this multi-million-dollar collection on a school teacher's budget. And that is in the 1930s and 40s and 50s when she did her primary collecting, it was before people really knew much of anything or there was really an established marketplace out there or any sort of knowledge. So Doris just loved dolls, loved them because of nostalgia to her youth, which if she died in 87 at 97, she would have been born in 1890. So antique dolls that we perceive of now were actually the direct nostalgic dolls of her youth. So this led to her collecting, which she would achieve by every weekend, getting in her car, driving to some random town she would choose on the map, and walking around that town, knocking on doors and asking people, do you have any old dolls you're going to throw out? I'll be happy to take them if you'd like. And they would just give them to her. I'm not kidding. But please, as I always warn, a little caveat, do not do that today. It will not end well. So back then you could, and that's how she built a collection that ended up selling for, I think at the time, like $2.3 million in total. It was an amazing event for me because of the way the collection just kind of I stumbled upon it, a complete fluke, as I've mentioned before, and then to be able to sell it and watch the battling of this from the podium. It was an amazing experience for me. My first big collection, my first big auction up on the podium from start to finish, selling this, and I will never, ever forget Doris Hupp and the Doris Hupp collection, though I never got the pleasure to meet her over the years because, interestingly, she kind of stopped collecting after the 1950s because you really couldn't go around knocking on doors at that point. The market had developed, information was out there, people started understanding that dolls were valuable. So she kind of stopped collecting and just enjoyed her multi-million-dollar quiet little collection in a little house in Stillwater, New Jersey, all during those later years. You know, sometimes I look at auctions as being a way to have constant in our lives of no matter what is happening, no matter, and this can be a personal thing with you, or it could even be a national crisis or an international crisis out there, that as long as you have the auction, you feel a sense of continuity. You feel a sense of permanence that, well, how do I say this? The things are going to be okay. The show must go on. And I've always believed that no matter what, you have to continue and you have to persevere to do auctions in periods of time and periods of history when even in your own personal life, you may not want to because it helps. It helps you and it helps others. And the one I remember more than anything else for this was, I call it the one after 9/11. And I'm taking a little bit of a cue from my favorite 90s show, Friends. Now I've revealed that to everybody out there. So yes, I am a Friends fanatic and have probably watched every season 5 times. So we'll title this one The One After 9/11. And that was a really emotional auction. So it was in Los Angeles and 9/11 occurred. And I believe this auction was held on like the 20th or 21st. So the first thing was when they shut down the airspace around the U.S., the question was, would anybody even be able to fly back then? Because you had a lot of people in those days. This was prior to internet bidding. You had to fly to the auctions, come to the sales, or bid on the phone. And so being there and having the sale in person was really critical. So the question was getting the auction out to LA, but as well, could any customers actually go there? Would the airlines be flying again? Well, luckily, about 5 days before the auction, airspace was opened back up. And then the question is, would anyone fly at that point? I mean, we were still in a very traumatic stage in this country at that point. It was only about 9 days after 9/11. And it dominated the news and everything we thought of and did at that point. And so we decided we're going to go on, that we have to keep moving. We felt, and I felt, that maybe it's the best thing for right now for doll collectors out there to have a distraction, to have something positive, to give them the confidence that we will go on. And so we did that sale. And I remember there were people that flew in and they were nervous, but they did. And they wanted to come in specifically for that reason, to be able to have something that day that would kind of release them a bit from the trauma and the stress they had been experiencing over the past week and a half. So it was a really important auction, and I felt very proud to be up there and be able to bring this to people and give them a distraction and give them something new to focus on. And remember, auctions, like anything, can be that distraction. It can be a fantastic opportunity for people to get off of today it would be doom scrolling on social media or doom scrolling on the news or listening to the news. It's just to go onto the auction and have some fun and share in something that makes you happy, that you're passionate about, that is positive. So the one after 9/11 always strikes me as that particular one. Now, the next one is when we sold the collection of Mildred Seeley. And I've talked about this before. You know, the characters, the person behind the collection can often impact a lot the feel and romance of a particular auction and how that event takes place. There are a few, obviously, over these years that fall into that category. But Mildred Seeley was one of the really early ones that helped me see the power of respect of a person, the power of love of a person, and how that impacts a particular sale. Millie's auction, we call her Millie, most everybody did, was amazing because 500 or 600 people flew in from all over the world, from Japan, from Europe, everywhere to attend this particular event. And it wasn't just about, I don't want to say it was just about, I've come to get a doll, though that was obviously at the back of a lot of people's minds. And I don't think anybody there wanted to go home empty-handed. But a lot of it more was just, I'm coming to pay respects. I'm coming to be a part of an event that is honoring a figure who was one of the most beloved people in the world of dolls for 2 generations. She had been long in not only the hobby and the passion of collecting antique dolls, but she founded Seeley Ceramics that really did bring to an entire generation of doll enthusiasts the idea of doll artistry, and that is making dolls, reproduction dolls, which translated to some extent into one-of-a-kind art dolls, which I think all went hand in hand during that time. One thing led to another. And Millie really did inspire this with her company that I don't know exactly when it started, but I want to say the 1960s even. But she went back quite a bit. And beyond that, not only building this incredible business and company, which she later sold, but continuing on as a collector and welcoming people to her house all the time. She would do seminars in her home with her antique dolls surrounding all of these doll artists. She would just welcome anybody who was passing through at the time in Tucson, Arizona, where she lived. You called her up. You were a doll collector. She didn't know you. Didn't matter. Come on over. I'll be happy to show you my doll. She was about 4'10", but 7 feet tall in personality, and she owned it. She was just wonderful. I mean, it got to the point in her 80s, I said, Millie, maybe you ought to stop letting people that you don't know just randomly come in your house to look at your dolls. And she responded, if they're doll people, they're good people. So that's all I need to know, and they're always welcome here. So when I'm asked to describe that sale, or when I talk to people who were at that auction, we all agree that the one word that you could use to describe that auction was love. And I'll never forget standing up on that podium and seeing the love across the room of 500, 600 people there in Las Vegas who came to honor Millie and take one of her dolls, protect her dolls. Because we've talked before, the protection of dolls is one of the most critical and crucial aspects of collecting. We want to protect them. And so they knew Millie had protected these, and they came not only to give her honor, but to tell her, to send her a message, we are going to be the next caretakers, and we will protect your dolls, Millie, and they will forever hold your name. So that sale, I will never, ever forget. Now, let's go to from the sublime to, I don't want to say ridiculous, because there's going to be some collector out there who collects these and is going to be offended. So, but it's definitely a little bit of a segue into something completely different. And that was the very famous auction of precious moments. Yes, precious moments. I might have talked about this in previous podcasts again as well. I can't keep up with everything, but we're going to highlight it here because it definitely was one of the most memorable auctions in history for reasons that, well, you might imagine. So the backstory on this is related to an incredible woman that I knew, a big name collector, Millie Harris out of Northern California. Now, Millie was an interesting personality in herself beyond just dolls. I call her the sticky bun queen of the San Francisco area. So in the East Bay, she had a diner and literally owned a diner. But this was not just any diner. She had a recipe, and a process for making sticky buns that was known all over the Bay Area. People would drive in for miles. On weekends in the morning, they would literally be lined up. It was like, I don't know what to compare it to, like an In-N-Out burger at 12:30 in the afternoon. If you've ever seen the lineups of the drive-through, it was kind of like that. They'd line up for sticky buns. Millie was famous for them, and she actually made a fortune on sticky buns, which I love, only in America. And so with that, she was a passionate doll collector. Now, we had sold part of Millie's collection years before, and then she was down to her main core collection, which were her fabulous Brews, Jameaux, all the important French bébés and German characters, everything. But she also had, tucked in her garage, she had been obsessed for a good 20 years with buying up every precious moment that was offered by the company and collected these. So a rather unusual, not exactly what she's been known for, but had this sort of side passion of precious moments. So when we came to get her collection, Millie said, now in the negotiating process with me, said, look, here's the bottom line. I will give you all these great dolls, but I need you to take the precious moments. She was moving at the time and she needed them out. They were consuming her entire garage. There were about 800 of them still sitting in the boxes. And so I'm thinking to myself, you got to be kidding me. I don't sell precious moments. I don't even know where to begin. So I called back to Florence and I said, what do we do? And she said, well, you know what? Maybe there's a market, and who better to try than us? Take them. So I did. And we packed up all of her great dolls, and then as well about 800 precious moments. And we brought them back. And, Florence is of the school, and God bless her, because she's right in this. Hey, if you're tasked with something, at least make the best of it that you can. Let's at least try. So we actually mounted, you're not going to believe this, a full cataloged auction, produced an actual book of these 800 precious moments, wondering, is there a market? I mean, there were precious moments museums out there. There were precious moments groups and collecting clubs. Maybe this market is bigger than we think. So we mounted this catalog, and let's just say it was not the biggest seller in the world. And I still have about 500 of them sitting in a warehouse somewhere here. If anybody's ever interested, just let me know. I'll be happy to send you one. On me. You just pay shipping. So we mounted this and did the catalog and had the auction. We held it in the Washington, D.C. area, and went in and set everything up, did a beautiful display, well, as beautiful as you can do with precious moments, of all the pieces still in their boxes. And then we opened the doors, flung the doors open, and I was waiting and hoping there would be this massive built-up frenzy and hundreds of people waiting out in the hallway, ready to storm in the room. No, there were two people. Yes, two people. They were enthusiastic. They were passionate, but there were two of them. And I realized I had 800 precious moments and two bidders from which to sell them. So I called Millie that morning as I'm looking at the not growing crowd and the two people anxiously looking through all of the precious moments there. And I said, Millie, this is not looking good. I want to be really upfront with you and find out, what do you want me to do? And she said, Stuart, all I wanted you to do was get them out of here. You did that. Sell them for whatever. So I'm like, okay. So I got up in the podium and I start making the announcements to my two enthusiastic bidders. And it suddenly occurred to me at that moment, why am I going to go through 800 lots with two people? Why don't I try something else first? So I actually just out of nowhere popped out the idea to them. I even know if I was half joking or not, but I said, hey, you know what? With just the two of you, you're both enthusiastic. You both came to buy. What do you think? Maybe we could sell the whole room as one lot. And they both nodded their head. Yeah. Why not? We'll go against each other for everything. And I thought, really? This is like an auctioneer's sort of dream or nightmare of you get to sell the entire room for one money. It's an old school thing. But anyway, so I thought, you would never actually do this in the real world, except, of course, if you have two bidders and it's precious moments. It seemed like it actually would work. So we did it. And the entire auction of 800 lots took about 14 minutes. And it only took that long because one of the women had to run out and call her credit card company to see if she can get her credit limit raised. And so she did, came back, put in more bids. We finished her off. I don't even remember what it brought, the entire collection. I want to say about 15,000, somewhere around in that range. And boom, the day was done. The winner packed up the items. Probably we had a little dealing on the side with the other person, I'm sure, after the auction, and we were on our way. So precious moments, no, I won't be doing them anymore. And we tried it. Believe me, we gave it our all. We even produced a book, but it was definitely a memorable one. Next up is a name that a lot of you are going to remember, and no, not only from doll collectors, but of celebrity. And you're probably thinking I'm talking about Shirley Temple, but not quite yet. First, I want to talk about Jane Withers, who was Shirley Temple's friend and foe as well. Foe, I say, in the sense of the movies they did, where Jane often played the rich, spoiled girl and Shirley played the poor girl. And so Jane Withers was quite a character, and she's now passed away, sadly. But I spent years knowing Jane, not only from the perspective of her work, but the reality of it being that she was a doll collector right from childhood all the way through to the end. She loved dolls. So in the early 2000s, Jane had contacted me, and Jane was a collector of everything. She also had one of the biggest collections in Hollywood of Hollywood memorabilia. I'll never forget walking into her warehouse, and she actually had, I don't know what she was thinking when she bought this, but she actually had one of the chariots used in Ben-Hur in the movie. So it was huge, but this warehouse was filled with everything. And she had decided she really needed to let go of this warehouse. It was getting too expensive. And so she needed to start selling things. And she decided to go ahead and sell all of her childhood dolls. That is, the dolls related to when she was a famous child actress. So we went in and we worked in the warehouse. Now, typically I go in, and this was a collection of about, I think, 250 pieces we took. Typically take me going into a collector home a day and a half. I ended up spending 10 days with Jane because everything, number one, was boxed up, and we had to move thousands of boxes within the warehouse to get to boxes to find dolls here and there. And we had to peek into a lot of boxes that weren't labeled correctly. But then the best part in working with Jane, or the worst part, depending if you really wanted to go home, was that every single doll Jane had to hold and tell stories about. And she would always, I'd pull the doll out, and she would always start off with this big exclamation of, "Dear Gussie, there she is. I haven't seen her since I was 10 years old." And she would hold the doll, and then she would tell stories about it. Now, I don't know how many of these stories were actually embellished or true, but they were always good. I will say that. My favorite one being the Disney character doll that we pulled out, Pluto. It was a plush portrait of Pluto that was actually given to her. And there was a photograph documenting this by Walt Disney. And there's a photograph of him presenting this to Jane in his office. And then she started telling me I'd have to sit there and listen to all the stories about Walt Disney and about what he meant to her. And then told me the story, I'll never forget the day that Mr. Disney came by my house in his little pickup truck, and he knocked on the door and he said, "Jane, get in here. I'm taking you on a picnic." And Jane said, "All right, Mr. Disney, let's go." So they ended up driving down to what was then Orange County, or still is Orange County, but what was then primarily just acres and acres everywhere of orange groves. And they went to this one orange grove, and they sat down. Mr. Disney put out a blanket, and they ate peanut butter and jelly sandwiches there. And Jane is recounting this and telling me that Mr. Disney then turned to me and said, "Jane, look around you. All of this. I have a vision. I just bought up all of these orange groves for miles, and I am going to make the most amazing park the world has ever seen. A park where children can come from around the world and have adventures and rides and regale in their love of Disney characters. And we're going to call it Disneyland." And Jane was so excited. She said, "That is such a wonderful idea, Mr. Disney. I can't believe it. This is so great. And having children from all over the world be able to come here and have fun together is such a great experience." And then here's where she adds the next part. "Because Mr. Disney, it's a small world after all." I looked at Jane, and she looked at me, and I said, "Jane, what are you telling me?" And she said, well, Mr. Disney looked at me and said, you know what, Jane? It is a small world. And I think you just gave me an idea. You love dolls. Let's use dolls in a ride in this park where we can show people through the dolls from around the world that it is a small world. And Jane thought, what a wonderful idea. And I said, Jane, are you telling me you gave the idea for It's a Small World? And she said, yep. So I can't verify this. The characters are all long gone, but it certainly made for a fabulous story. And she was an amazing character. That auction was held in Kansas City. I forget the exact year. I want to say 2007 or so, around there, and maybe earlier than that even. And it was quite the event, let me tell you, because we flew Jane out. She came in for the whole auction event. She was dancing in front of the audience, talking during the sale. She was wonderful in regaling people with stories as the doll would come up and tell them what it meant to her in her childhood. And it was quite the event. And she stayed there and did autographs for people who lined up literally down the block. And I had to sit with Jane after the auction because we couldn't turn people away, even though the auction was over at that point. They were still lined up for autographs. We ended up being there till 1 a.m. And I remember I was basically holding Jane to get her back to her room because she could barely walk, but she would never let a fan down. And she hung right in there to the end till 1 a.m, signing autographs and talking with people and telling them stories. It was a great one. So the next event, many of you might remember this that have been following Theriault for years, was the 3-day auction event of the antique dolls, toys, and ephemera from the Lego Museum in Billund, Denmark. Now, these were not Legos, okay? So let me clear that up right away. We didn't auction off Legos, but the Lego Park in Billund, Denmark had a massive museum, which was at the time probably the largest doll museum in Europe. And it was decided during a restructuring that they were going to close the museum part of the Lego theme park that people visited from around the world because it didn't really fit in with the vision of promoting Lego. And so they contacted us, and we, of course, went over and spent weeks there packing up this entire museum and transporting it back to the U.S., which was then brought out to Las Vegas for a huge 3-day event. That was an incredible moment, again, where people were flying in from around the world. Very, very rare dolls throughout this time. One of the most exhausting auctions I've ever done because it was 3 solid days. So we're talking 3 days of about 10 hours per day up on the podium conducting this particular event. And I was pretty beat down after that sale. This, again, was, I'm going to say, about 2006, 2007, right around in there. And the auction was memorable, not just because of the Lego name and the memories many people had going to this museum over the years, but for some interesting characters that came to the sale. One I remember in particular is a person who I've referred to as the Man in White. And I believe I wrote about him actually in my book, Never Ending Stories. And he was quite a character. I'd never seen him before. He was about 40 years old, nice looking guy, dressed impeccably in all white suit, totally white. And he sat in the back row and really didn't kind of fit in to what might be conceived. No, we have many people of all different looks and age groups and styles, but he definitely did stand out in that crowd that day of about 400, 500 people. And he sat all the way in the back against a wall, and he had a cell phone at the time, and he was always on the cell phone talking to someone, and he started bidding that first night. And he started bidding on major pieces. Now, we're talking Parians primarily. Actually, it was all Parians. They were rare Parians for sure, but he was getting into some very heated bidding wars with some other major collectors, and we were shattering record after record on Parians. Oh, I shouldn't use that term Parians. Florence always gets mad at me. I'm supposed to say so-called Parians. So excuse me for that. So anyway, the bidding went wild. We were having so-called Parians. Do I have to say that every time? They were bringing upwards of $20,000. Examples in the past that had been bringing $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 were getting in the 20s in these bidding wars. And the Man in White was always at the core, always at the root of these bidding wars and successfully getting probably 50% he would go on. So It was during this first night that I decided, maybe I better go introduce myself after the auction and find out who the heck this guy is, because I had never seen him before and everybody was whispering like, who is this? So after the sale, went back and introduced myself and we started chatting. And so I said, so I'm just curious, are you a collector aficionado of so-called Parians? And he looked at me and said, oh, no. He said, actually, I was sent here from Fiji by our great leader, the guru, I forget the name, Maharaja Mahalaha or whatever, that saw in a magazine photos of these Parians and an advertisement for this auction in one of the antique trade magazines. And he instantly looked at these photographs and he saw something in these, a spirituality, a link to the heavens, that he said we must own selections of these for our commune here in Fiji. And so, I mean, you could imagine my reaction, not quite what I expected. I was expecting more like, oh, I'm a collector of them, or, oh, my wife sent me to bid on these, or whatever, but not that they were being bought for a great spiritual leader because he saw a link to the heavens through Parian dolls. And of course, my reaction, I'm always quick on my feet, said, I've often seen the spirituality of Parians myself. I really haven't, but I wanted to make him feel reassured and comfortable in this. And so he ended up staying the whole weekend, bought up about 27 or 28 Parians, took them away, paid for them, and off they went to Fiji. We never saw him again. So I've always imagined whatever happened to these Parians was a shrine built to them on an island in Fiji, and they all go and they meditate to the Parians or something. But one of the most strangest occurrences at a particular auction I've ever had, and it all happened at the Great Lego Auction weekend and made for a great story down the road. Not every story at an auction is uplifting. And one of the most memorable auctions was memorable because it was the most difficult auction I've ever had to do before. In 2009, I literally was at the airport boarding a plane to head out to our major January gala auction held in Southern California every year at that time. And we had a fabulous 3-day event with the Margaret Hartshorn collection. We had the Crystal Powers collection, and then we had other specialty auctions being held on Sunday. 3 full major days, the banquet. This was always a huge event with hundreds and hundreds of collectors coming in from around the world. I was at the airport, ready to board my flight when my mother called, Florence, to let me know and tell me in tears that my stepfather, George, her husband, had just passed away. And obviously, this was shocking. And though he had not been well for years, it was certainly a difficult phone call to receive at the airport as I'm about to board a plane. So I immediately went up. I had my flight changed and drove back home and spent the day with Florence and talking with her and working her through. We all came to her support and mourning myself as well. But the reality is, it was 2 days away from the biggest auction event of the year. The show must go on. You can't do it any other way. And it was my stepfather, George, who had always taught me that over the years as we drove through snowstorms to get to a site to have an auction. You've got to get there. You've got to do the sale. So it was decided that Florence was going to not go to this auction for obvious reasons, and that I would fly out and have to do all of the sale on my own with our crew. And in the process of, our staff and myself, everyone mourning and in shock. But we did it. And remember when I said that sometimes doing these things at a moment when you don't want to, at the hardest times, and it's a good lesson in life, I think, as well for everyone, that if you can force yourself and push yourself through it, going on and doing things is actually a wonderful and positive, uplifting way to get through these moments. I'm not saying it helped us in any way with the pain, but it helped us forge a path forward. And I did that auction that weekend. It wasn't easy, but especially without Florence being there, but we got through it. And I'll never forget that sale and what it means to persevere through your own emotions, because the rest of the crowd, they came there for a good time. They came there for energy, for excitement, for something they look forward to all year long. And by golly, I was going to give it to them. And so it's one that I'm kind of proud of myself for fighting through and bringing people a joyful 3-day event. So moving on now, well, sand pails. Now you're thinking, oh, wait, is this going to be another precious moment story? But yes, we once had an entire cataloged auction of children's sand pails from the early 1900s with shovels in many cases. And it was a beautiful art form that was done, were these tin sand pails that were often lithographed with different themes throughout them, typically childhood related, obviously, or seashore related. And I'd stumbled on a collection of these in New Jersey, and about 300 of them, 350, the person who was passionate sand pail collector. And she actually lived on the ocean in New Jersey, so it went hand in hand with her house there. And so we decided, let's give it a go. So we took the entire sand pail collection and we produced a special catalog for it. And it was held in part with our big January events that I just talked about a few minutes ago. I forget which year. I want to say 2009, maybe. Actually, no, even earlier than that, like 2005. And so we had this on the Sunday as one of the specialty sales. So you never know what to expect, but there really were beautiful objects. We had done advertising for it out in the general antique field to meet non-doll people where they are, because they're a bit of a different market clientele, I guess, for sand pails than you'll find for dolls. So there was crossover, obviously. So we had this auction event, and we had like 40 people show up for it. Thank God it wasn't two like the Precious Moments. And they were wonderful. They were the most passionate collectors of this little niche thing, and showing you that there are really wonderful groups of collectors out there for things that you might not ever imagine that really are forming lifelong pursuits in these particular genres. And I never imagined it with sand pails, but by golly, they were there. But apparently they had never found each other, because none of them knew each other. And that auction turned into like this great social event. It was like, wow, you're a sand pail collector too? I thought I was the only one. And I'll never forget that auction. At the very last lot, suddenly a man who had been sitting in the back and bidding all day long, and he stood up. And I'm thinking, oh no, when this happens, it's usually not a good thing. So he stood up and he said, I want to stop the auction right here, and I want to say something. And I'm like, okay. And so he said, and it's the last lot, I just want to get it done. But he said, I just want to say that this was the greatest moment, the greatest day of my life as a sand pail collector. To feel just all this love in the room for something that I have been so passionate and in love with for years, to see that there's others just like me was so validating. It was the greatest day I've ever had as a collector. And I just want to thank everyone else here, even if we bid against each other, no matter what. I want to thank you all for making me feel wonderful today as a sand pail collector. I was practically in tears after this. Everybody applauded. Everybody hugged each other. It was just the most beautiful moment to witness in the world of collecting, and shows how we can come together through collecting. Nobody knew anything about any of these people, but they had one shared passion, and they came together in this great day, and we actually never saw them again. But I'll always remember that moment, because we never got a great collection of sand pails again. So if you have one, let me know. I'd love to see if these people are still around and still collecting 20 years later. So the next one, I think we can all agree, and I'm not going to go too deep into it because I did a 2-part series on this particular auction in what was a 10-year later reflection, but that is on Shirley Temple. And when we handled her personal collection, not only of dolls, but all of her childhood memorabilia, and there's going to be a top 3 list of most memorable events I've ever done in my life. This one would certainly be right there, maybe even the top. And it was, well, what I would say is go back to, I forget which episode, but a few months ago, I did a 2-part series that were the takeaways 10 years later from the Shirley Temple auction, which was held in 2015 in Kansas City, and that people came from around the world to attend. It was truly a room full of love, a room full of bidding, a room that sat there for 12 hours and listening to me on the podium, regaling stories of Shirley and selling these incredible, important objects, the joy they brought people, the tears that were shed, the laughs that were laughed. It was just that day. I'll never forget it. I can relive it in my mind over and over again sometimes as I'm sitting on a plane somewhere and just thinking about how great that day felt. And you can actually go to Theriault's YouTube channel, and if you go way down some years past all of Florence's videos, you'll actually find where a portion of that auction was recorded that you can actually see and relive even 10 years later now at 2025 of this incredible auction event of Shirley Temple. So I'll leave that at that. Not going to share too much else in particular because I've done other podcasts and stories about it. And on that same light, another major figure who I should probably do a whole podcast going back, and maybe we'll wait until the 10-year mark. But in 2019, we sold the collection of another celebrity, and a celebrity for different reasons, but that is Huguette Clark. And this was in a very memorable sale because Huguette is beloved in the world of dolls as kind of a hero, and that she had been a protector and a passionate collector for many, many years, but a really unique and interesting character. And rather than go too deep into the history and story of Huguette Clark, I would say go out and get a copy of Empty Mansions, the best-selling book. I think it was 9 weeks on the bestseller list for the New York Times, called Empty Mansions by Bill Dedham. And it details her entire life and the mystery of Huguette Clark, including sections about her as a doll collector. So we were blessed with getting this collection to offer to the marketplace. And it was this hidden lost collection that she had started when she was a child. And that was in the early 1900s. I think she died at 104. So you can put that into perspective. And this sale, it was memorable for a number of reasons. Not only Huguette Clark, not only for the love in that room and the people that came in from everywhere, but it was also Theriault's 50th anniversary auction event held in the big January gala that we did every year at that time, and held in a very special place at the Ritz-Carlton in Santa Barbara, California, where Bella Squardo, the estate that she owned for many, many years, was being turned into a public exhibit home, an incredible estate. And so we decided to do it there. It was Theriault's 50th anniversary. What better location, better spot, better event, and better name to have for a particular sale, because she had been a part of almost all that 50 years in our company as well. And it was incredible. And little did we know all the love that we would feel for Theriault's 50th anniversary, for Huguette Clark, for everything, all the events we did that weekend, including special tours of Bella Squardo, her home, that we were about to, in just a few months, as we turned into early 2020, that the auction world and events and everything as we know it would change dramatically. And that would be COVID would come along and really shift the consciousness of how things were done. So it's memorable to me because that auction signifies kind of a last moment, really. A last moment in the old ways when you would have these huge events and people would come. Now they'll come, but they'll be on the internet primarily. And that's a fundamental shift that really COVID brought along. And Huguette Clark symbolized that last era, that last moment of the old ways. And it just so happened to be Theriault's 50th anniversary. A few others that I'll talk about for sure. Any of the Hannah Bouktis auctions over the years so are memorable for different various reasons. Hannah Bouktis, most prolific collector in Europe for decades. And she wasn't just any kind of collector. Hannah would fixate on a particular niche or category of the genre of figurative art or childhood or whatever. And she would absolutely go wild on that category for about 10 to 15 years, buying up the best pieces in the world, learning everything about them and protecting them and owning them, and then deciding, okay, I've done that. I will sell that collection. I'm on to something new. She did it with miniatures and dollhouses, with French fashions, with half dolls, with Neapolitan creche figures, with French bébés. And so for 20 years, Theriault every few years would have another Bouktis collection to offer as she would move into a new category. And every one of them were fabulous events. And you can go back and look at some of the archived of different auctions from Hannah Bouktis. The most recent and the final one of her collection prior to her passing away was a fabulous two-part auction of Neapolitan creche figures. And it started, the first one being her dollhouse miniatures. And then probably the one that people remember the most was her French fashion auction, which was fabulous, held at the Waldorf Astoria in New York in 2015. Another auction that comes to mind, speaking of Europe, the Stein am Rhein Museum. And this was an incredible collection, an incredible auction. And sometimes it's not so much the auction event was great. Don't get me wrong. The people came in from around the world. This was about 2015 as well to attend this, which I think was held in Naples, Florida at the time where we did the auction. But sometimes the story is not as much about the auction event, though it was a typical, normal, huge, well-received auction. Sometimes there's an interesting backstory as to getting the collection. So the Stein am Rhein Museum was very, very well known in Europe for a number of years, primarily in that sort of 1970s to early 90s period. European collectors would always make pilgrimages there to see this museum that was just a private museum owned by a collector. So it had closed down, I want to say, in 2000. And for 15 years, it sat in the very same place in this little 17th century historic building on a cobblestone street in the historic town of Stein am Rhein and was never opened. And so people always wondered what happened to this collection. Well, it had been sitting with the family, and the collector had not been well, and why she ended up closing the museum, because she would go in there every day and open it. She couldn't do it anymore, but she still wanted to know it was there while she was alive. So for 15 years, she was alive for a good portion of that and just wanted the museum at least to stay there. Maybe she would get better, but maybe she just loved knowing it was there, even though it was not open. So I'll never forget the two things that happened when I first went to look at this museum. The family brought me in, and I remember they took out a little old skeleton key and they opened the door of this 17th century little building. And that door, I mean, one credit card, you could have opened that door in 2 seconds. It was pretty easy. It was just an old skeleton key. It took nothing. And there was no alarm system. There was nothing in it. And I'll never forget, right in the entrance, I guess a good fortune it was in Switzerland, because right in the entrance was the famous A-Mark boy that is now sitting in the Barry Art Museum. And what was unique about this is it not only sat right inside the door, but sitting behind the doll was a giant sign that said, "The world's most valuable doll." I was like stopped dead in my tracks of like, if anybody ever broke into the museum, the thief would probably think, well, thank you. I appreciate your identifying the one piece I want to make sure to get. There was cobwebs we had to move out. It was like going into a vault that had been sealed for generations. So we ended up packing that, and I'll never forget that there was one of the doll tours that was going on in Europe at the time. And I was packing the museum, and we had the truck out front, and we spent like a week there getting everything out and loaded up to be containerized back to the U.S. And I remember taking a break, and I walked out of the museum one afternoon while we were working, and I opened the door, and there are about 15 American doll collectors standing there looking at me. I don't know who was shocked more, me for seeing 15 of my American clients sitting in Stein am Rhein, Switzerland on this cobblestone street looking at me, or them. Is that Stuart who just walked right out of there? They had been there to look at Sascha Morgenthaler's, a little museum there, I guess, that is in Stein am Rhein for Sascha Morgenthaler. And in the process, they decided to walk by and see the site where the Stein am Rhein Museum was some years ago. And there I walked right out. It was really a funny experience, but a great auction, great event. I absolutely will always remember that. Then there's one that I don't even remember what auction it was, the title of the auction. I don't really remember when exactly, other than it was in the early to mid 90s. And it was during my early period of being up on the podium. But that moment when I call it, in honor of friends again, the one where the lady passed out. And that's all I remember it as. I remember being up on the podium, and we had a rare German character. It was one of the Simon and Halbig 1300 series, a lady character. And we had it up, and we started the auction bidding on this particular piece. And it got up to about 16, 17,000 at that point. And all of a sudden, the woman who was in the back and had been standing up and bidding on this, she collapsed on the floor. Now, there's no playbook, rather, about what do you do in an auction when your bidder passes passes out. So I just kind of stopped in a state of shock. I'm only laughing because it turned out okay. I stopped the auction and had to think about what's next. So immediately there was a nurse in the crowd, ran in the back and started administering first aid or whatever, and found out she was okay. She just blacked out for a moment, and she just laid there, and they got her water. And I thought, okay, the nurse said she's fine. I said, well, let's get the auction back going. And I start looking for $17,000. And so I call it out, and now $17,000. And all of a sudden, from the back of the room, a hand went up, and the woman yelled out, 17,000 in the most feeble voice you could ever imagine. And I mean, the crowd was in shock. I took the bid, of course. Why not? And we had it 17,000, and then no one would bid against her. No one. And I realized, oh my gosh, it's the ultimate bidding technique. Just feign passing out. Not that she did that. This was real. But if you just feign passing out, who would have the heart to bid against you after that? So it was really a definite learning experience, a great moment, a lighthearted moment. Everybody was so happy for her, and she went home fine, and she went home with her doll. So that was a great moment for sure. We talked about that the story is not only just the auction, but sometimes what happened to get to that auction. And Berta Hackney, her collection was for sure one of those events that I will never forget, not only because Berta had been a dear friend of mine for many, many years, a character like you cannot imagine. She wrote the book on Texas characters. I'm telling you, she was right out of it and just absolutely loved Berta. Everybody loved Berta and knew her across the country. She was a fixture at many auctions and shows and conventions. And so in 2014, I get a call from one of Berta's caretakers, who was the former mayor of Waco, Texas, and he was signed as Berta's caretaker or executor in case anything happened. And he called to inform me Berta had had a massive stroke and was in intensive care and is not expected to make it. And I was obviously devastated over the news. She was in her early 80s, I believe, at the point, but still absolutely devastated. And we just started talking. He said, well, I want you to stay tuned. He said, you know, part of my responsibility is this doll collection, and half the town of Little Hubbard, Texas, a little tiny one-street town in East Texas, half that town has keys to her house. And so we may need to be talking very, very soon, and I want to make sure you're ready. And I said, just keep me updated on what's happening with Berta. So after a couple of days, he called me and he said, well, Stuart, it's not looking good. The doctor said that she's in a coma. She's probably never coming out of this coma. She is never for sure going to be leaving that hospital. And they just said it's a matter of time. We're going to need to do something. I can't risk the dolls sitting there for months on end with no supervision or anyone protecting them. And I can't be there every day, 24 hours. So we agreed. I wanted the confirmation that he was absolutely sure that there is no chance she's going to ever recover from this. And if she even survives, she will never leave the hospital. Well, I think you all know where this is going. We went and we packed the collection. We spent a week there. And we packed up two 25-foot trucks, something around 2,000 pieces that we took out of that house. And we got them all the way back up to Maryland and got them into our warehouse, waiting for preparations for an auction event that we were going to do in her honor and that we ended up doing. But not before I got the worst phone call I've ever received in my life. But let me just say, too, it was the best phone call I ever received in my life, in a sense, too. But the worst because who would have ever imagined? Apparently, at Baylor University, the hospital she was at, they decided to try some experimental medication with Berta, and she came out of the coma. Not only did she come out of the coma, but she actually walked out of the hospital. And she went home within another 2 weeks. And she walked into her house. No one had told her anything as of yet. No one knew or thought that this would end up happening. She just made it on herself that she was going home. She went home. She walked in their house. And as it was recounted to me, turned to everybody who was in the house and she exclaimed, "Where the hell are my dolls?" You can imagine that first phone call was to me. Of course, blame Stuart. And so she called me and said, "What the hell have you done?" Said in her great Texas accent. And I said, "Berta," I said, "I was just following the orders and I did what I was told to do by the executor. And I'm so sorry, but you know what? I love you. You've been a friend for years. We'll bring everything back." And there was silence on the phone. And Berta said, "You know, I guess maybe it was meant to be." who knows if I can take care of him anymore. I'm physically not great, and it's just a matter of time before a damn tornado comes and takes him, so it might as well be you. Only time I've ever been compared to a tornado, but there it is. And so we sold Berta's collection. She lived for another 8 years, but she said, it was really fun seeing my collection go. We'll wrap it up with a couple quick ones here that I just remember. The auction opened wide the portals, or something along those lines, that we had in St. Louis in 2023. Very memorable to me because this was the first auction where we had finally gone back to having sales live again with a crowd post-COVID. And it was just such a happy experience for everyone to come together again in that auction room held at the National Convention, to laugh, to look down at the crowd and see those smiling faces. I mean, I've fed off crowds at auctions for years, and it's changed, obviously. I primarily auction to a camera anymore with thousands of you online, and I try to give you that same feeling that you had when you sat in that room, that same fun and enjoyment throughout the day, the same interaction. But for me, it's difficult because I don't get to see all your beautiful faces out there. And I used to feed off of that, love that. Your laughter, your eye rolling, your yelling at me, sell it already. I don't hear any of this anymore or see it. So it's difficult. But that was the first one after COVID that I got to relive after 2 years of auctioning purely in a studio with no crowd, to be able to see everybody again. It was such a fabulous time. And then, of course, I'll finish off with one sale that we recently held January of 2024, and that was the auction of Rosalie Weil. And I invite you to go back. I'm not going to talk too much about it. Invite you to go back and listen to my 10 takeaways from the Rosalie Weil event, both events that we had, because they were 2 parts. But that first part auction, it was emotional, uplifting, exciting. It reminded me of that Mildred Seeley sale, but it was a difference. It was a turning point, I realized, at that auction, because remember Mildred Seeley, beloved, and 600-700 people came to that event in Las Vegas. But then we had Rosalie Weil, as beloved as Mildred Seeley, and gave so much to the world of dolls. And it became the highest grossing doll auction in world history at $5 million. So it's puzzling when you think about it, but there were only 85 people at that, or 100 people, maybe at most, at that particular event in comparison to Millie's. Well, that's because there were thousands of them online bidding. And we knew at that point the world had changed. And if they weren't going to fly in for Rosalie, this was a whole different world. Now, people had a great time. People paid honor. People paid respects. People were excited, bidding from all over the world on Rosalie's pieces. But nobody wanted to really come and be there anymore. And I realized this was a turning point. It was a turning moment. So it was memorable from being the greatest auction and by a beloved character, emotional for me because I've been friends with the family for many, many years. I really grew up in the business with Rosalie and her family, have become friends with Shelley, the daughter, as well, that I've worked with over these past few years on this project. It stands right up there with Shirley Temple as being one of the top 3 events of my career that has been fabulous. There are so many more. I could spend hours talking about this, but a podcast can only go on so long. So maybe I'll do a part 2 down the road somewhere along the line of talking about some of the other sales that I remember and that I love, like Sandy Kralowitz, and even just recently the Bill Greening collection or the Ursula Breck collection out of Europe. These are all worthwhile talking about too, with great stories. So we'll come back again and address more of them. But I wanted to give you a few and give you a feeling as to why an auction is memorable. It may not be the greatest auction in the world. It may be a failure like Precious Moments, or it may be emotional like the one after George died, my stepfather, or it may be one that was uplifting, even though not a high grossing sale like Sam Pails, because it brought collectors who never knew each other together. And this is what I hope you got out of this, is that an auction for me is more than just selling stuff. An auction for me is actually something that should be uplifting, fun, exciting, challenging. It should be a joy, and it should be a constant. It should be that thing you can count on and rely on as an event. And I hope you have other passions and other things too you look for, but this could be one that consistently keeps coming to get you energized, get you enjoying and passionate and engaged in the hobby all the way to the end, paddles up, as I always say, to the end. And auctions are one of the most fun, I believe, and exciting ways to collect that are out there. So I hope you enjoyed this. Look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of The Curious Collector. Let's get together next week. Bye, everybody.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Curious Collector. The Curious Collector is hosted by Stuart Holbrook and produced by Tammy Trujillo. We invite you to follow us on social media and feel free to leave any questions you have for Stuart on Facebook at Stuart Holbrook-Theriault or follow the Theriault Company Facebook page. And you can stay up to date with the latest auctions and events at Theriaults.com. We'll talk to you on the next episode of The Curious Collector.